Hi everyone, I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you in person. And thank you so much for the Finnish Association for Psychedelic Research for allowing me to talk a bit about psychedelics and reimbursement. I'll be taking you through my thoughts, my experience on this, for me, very interesting topic of seeing how can we make psychedelics reimbursed care? How can we go from the research to the actual implementation, to the actual access to patients? So, a little bit of background on myself. I'm a psychologist by study, and I've been in the psychedelic field for the last 7 years. You might know me from my work at Blossom, where I map out what psychedelic research is happening, do a summary every month, do more things around it, but really tracking things on the research side. And over the last 3 years, I've been looking more and more at what is happening on the practice side, on the implementation side. A lot of that work I've been doing with Delphi. It's a US based consultancy, so I've been able to soak in some of the information, learn about what has happened there, because I think they're maybe 1, 2, 3 years ahead of us here in Europe on saying, okay, how do we actually put this into practice and what needs to happen? And so I'm trying to also take some of those lessons back here to Europe. And I've done a lot of that on a report that came out earlier this year. I'll talk about it in a slide or two. So, psychedelics and reimbursement. Why even talk about it? Like, why don't you say, oh, just follow the steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? It is because with psychedelics, there is a big change. It is different from what is out there. It's not a drug you take home and then see what happens after weeks, months. That is relatively low cost usually. It's not like a talk therapy as usual. It's not something let's follow a 6-week program or 12-week program. But really, it is a combination of a talk therapy and a drug component. Of course, we can slice and dice this in different ways and see where is the emphasis, but it is something that is new, something that is different, something that is psychoactive. So there is a challenge to see how can we match these programs, these trials, this promise, where we see people that weren't being treated with what is there available right now. So people with treatment-resistant depression or people with PTSD that have had this for 15 years or more, seeing really positive results. So from that big promise, how do we actually go to patients? And that's what I want to talk about a bit today. So why I'm talking about this? Next to the other things I mentioned, I've written the Reimbursement Pathways for Psychedelic Therapies in Europe report. It came out earlier this year. And in that report, we really dive into everything that needs to happen. And I'll talk about a very small part of that report here today on how to go to reimbursed care with psychedelic therapies. I've mainly done this together with Martin Gisby. He's a market access consultant, so he really knows how to go from a promising drug, from a promising treatment to the actual implementation in healthcare systems. So I learned so much from his side. We were also supported by Thaddeus Harrod from Perea, Josh Hartman from Psychedelic Alpha, and Victor Gavatel and Samudu Mujina from Psychedelics Europe. So we also had a lot more information from that policy, from the developer side, where they know a lot about. This report was supported by Noise Mind, a Swedish nonprofit that sponsors mostly research, but they are also really looking at implementation. How do we make this happen? And the report is written for a very broad audience, so it's readable for everyone. I think maybe most of you here today can skip the research part and say, okay, I know this. But there's a lot of information on what are those next steps, and I'll present about that today. But also speaking both to people in our psychedelic bubble, in our psychedelic ecosystem, and people outside of it to really give them a lay of the field and to explain, okay, what are things that need to happen. And there will be a link to the report, of course, at the end of the presentation. So what do we set out to do? Map out what is happening in Europe. And there we took the Netherlands, Germany, the Czech Republic, and the United Kingdom as a few of the example countries. And it also covers different types of healthcare systems. So for instance, here in the Netherlands, we have a private insurance model. But then again, there's a state sponsorship or sort of a state. Yeah, it's not the US that everyone's here. It's no, not everyone, but a lot of people have to take care of it themselves. It's private, but again, all the private companies are relatively the same, and there are 4 large ones. But then there are different systems, like in Finland, where you have more of that state or country level insurance, which in some ways makes things easier. But yeah, so we have different models that we looked at. This is not something that we did alone, is that it's not just our ideas. We had conversations with about 25 different stakeholders, and the stakeholders really were from a wide range of backgrounds, so both within psychedelics but also outside of it. So think of people who are on more the regulatory side who need to evaluate this, or people with a lot of pharma background but not in psychedelics, to see what are some of the bottlenecks that maybe we are not seeing. So together with them, we identified challenges and potential solutions, and I'll talk about both today. All with the goal of facilitating access to psychedelic therapies, so seeing how can we actually put this into practice, how can we put this into the real world. So, challenges first. What are things that we're bumping into, or sort of with the model that we have? And again, I'm talking about the current Lycos or Compass Pathways models, the psychoactive psychedelics that have to be taken in a treatment facility, a hospital, or somewhere else. So really sticking to that model, not the new non-hallucinogenic psychedelics. And also our report is really focused on the classical psychedelics, and we also talk about MDMA in academy mostly as a comparator, because that is generally, and also in Finland, already out there. This is Bravado. What are some of those challenges? Economic hurdles. I just want to talk about this because I think that's something that's very pressing, is that psychedelic-assisted therapies is something that is quite intensive, something that will take place in a limited amount of time. So we have a lot of cost, and maybe it's 5,000 euros, maybe it's 30,000 or more. So it will really differ per where it's implemented and also how much the drug itself will cost. But it's going to be more expensive than talk therapy that's happening now or SSRIs. So how do we make that case that something that is more expensive can also lead to positive outcomes that last beyond the treatment window itself, but can extend months, maybe even years, as we've seen in some of the studies. So how do we make that case? And that's something where we really, at this time, don't have information in Europe. There's some early studies like ongoing, but we don't have those health economic analyses that, for instance, Elliot Messiah has already done in the US. So that's one of the challenges. Another one, infrastructure, right? Like, how do we actually do this? What do we need? Who needs to be trained? From a pharmacist to a psychiatrist, what training can we later accept, and what can those societies themselves accept that is useful, and how can we put that into place? A lot more on this slide, a lot more in the report, but just a few highlights of seeing how challenging it can be to have this novel type of therapy that generally hasn't been done. There are some behavioral/drug therapies where they say, okay, you need to have a behavioral component here, but with psychedelics, at least for a lot of people, we have the assumption that the therapeutic aspect is very important. So how does this pathway happen? How does it look like? That's mapped out here on the left side. And yeah, we go from a successful phase 3 trial in Europe. And again, that's the question, how much needs to happen in Europe? How big does that trial need to be if there is evidence coming also from the US? To regulatory registration, then the evaluation. So that happens at a country level. So EMA says that this therapy is approved. They say, okay, the evidence is legit. But then countries themselves will do the evaluation on if they want to approve this, and then also later reimburse it, and at what price. So that happens at the country level. And still there, in 2030, more of them will go back to the European level, but that hasn't happened yet, or it will not happen soon for psychedelics. So then there's the pricing reimbursement conversation. Again, that differs per country. Some countries say, I'm going to look at what others have done. Others are looking at cost effectiveness. Others are seeing what are comparable prices of drugs. So really, that differs. And then contracting with providers. So seeing, okay, how would you actually implement this? And again, what infrastructure is there already, and what can we prepare? And what I want to also say here, you kind of see this wedge here, is that, or that seesaw, that like, how do we implement something that's both effective but also accessible? are there things that we can or need to pare down? And can we do that while still maintaining safety and efficacy? I think that's a question we have to keep on asking ourselves. So what are some pathways to psychedelics? And what do you see now versus the future? And I think now we have sort of a square peg that we need to put into that round hole, and hopefully in the near future, we can make some of those changes. Like I was saying about the cost of the treatment, like, can we go from the current model to maybe group therapy? Can we see that we can lower the cost of the administration of a psychedelic therapy to also make it accessible to more people? And in that evaluation, can we convince the evaluators that there are long-term effects, and of course collect that data also to make the case that this is something that has potential? I think there an analogy to gene therapies may be useful, where there's a really high upfront cost, way higher than for psychedelics, but there can be a long-term positive outcome. So how do we actually make that case? And then infrastructure and implementation. How do we already build the building blocks, the preparation for when this gets implemented? And then, for instance, in the Netherlands and in Germany, some larger scale 2-year training programs that are being run. That could be something that's later approved or codified by a psychologist, psychiatrist association. But again, these are our early days. To looking specifically at drug developers and regulators, so going a bit earlier in that process, drug developers do need to engage with the EMA early, and there's been a large workshop somewhere last year where some early things got ironed out and some publications came out of, but really keep on talking with EMA on what evidence they want to see. And there again, things like blinding are important to see. Okay, how do we present this? How do we develop the trial without overblowing the cost, right? If we say we do a factorial design and we have 4 different arms, it's going to be way more expensive, and maybe it becomes less interesting also for the drug developer. So there's again those different considerations to play with. And yeah, how do we display comparative value? And that's something I haven't talked about yet, but at that country level evaluation, for instance, Germany generally, and probably also here, wants to see a head-to-head trial with a current treatment. So there could be an SSRI, there could be ECT, there could be talk therapy, but really what is the gold standard right now, and do a head-to-head study. So not just do it on paper, but actually in one trial. So for instance, a German consortium is now trying to do this philanthropically for a phase 3 trial. But yeah, the big question will be, say, Compass has their whole data package. Can they go to Germany and convince them? I think that with what we have, or with a European trial, against a placebo, maybe the EMA is going to say yes, but then at that country level for that payer perspective, is that data enough? So from the regulatory side, I think there also still a lot to do, and I talked a bit about this already, but one alternative pathway to going to those phase 3 trials and then going through all these different steps is doing real world evidence trials in a country in Europe. And people here in the Netherlands are talking about this, seeing can we actually do this on the ground in the real world and then prove something based on that data, and then do that with psilocybin or MDMA, so that it's not a drug developer, but it's more a philanthropically or government funded trial that does this. But again, early days to be talking about this. Building infrastructure, so really going into that to the other side of the equation, like we really want to already invest in facilities and the workforce. Think about the different reimbursement models, see how can we actually do this. Even if we go to the normal pathway, can we say there will be payout based on how long people stay out of the indication. That's not the way to say it, but they stay healthier or happier. And I think one thing that's important that is challenging to keep hammering home is to have that conversation, to bring all those different stakeholders together to make this happen. So how does Finland stack up versus other countries? So it'd be nice to say a little bit about where you're at versus the countries we looked at in the report. And I think generally it's a picture that you see for a lot of countries in Europe, is that there is some reimbursement from Spravato. First it was partial, then it became full. So there is already some underground experience with how do we administer this. So I think that's great to see that already those early signals are there. And of course, here with this conference, it's a great place to see what is happening and to get people thinking about this. I think that also is different between Europe and the US. It's less in the zeitgeist. So yeah, I think conferences like this really do help. And then in other countries in Europe, like Germany, there is also just esketamine. The Czech Republic, of course, now will have psilocybin available next year. A big question that I still have is like, what will be reimbursed for that? And then different is the UK, where esketamine hasn't been approved, but for instance, they are now doing a ketamine trial that's partly government sponsored. So that's also looking at what are different pathways to go at. So finally, a few slides on like what's next. We have this report came out earlier this year. What are we going to do, or what do I hope happens? So the next project I'm working on right now is reimbursement and infrastructure for psychedelics in Europe. So this is a continuation on the work that we've done in the report. And we want to map out a multi-year roadmap to really make those evaluations go better and to get psychedelics to become approved therapies that work in practice. And I'm doing this again with Martin Gisby from Psychedelic Access, and also doing this partly under the banner of Delphi. And we have Drug Science, a UK-based nonprofit, as the fiscal sponsor. So this again is a nonprofit project. And why do you think this needs to happen, and why do you think this needs to happen right now? So that we see without taking action at this stage, then maybe just a drug developer comes in and does this with one drug for one indication with one treatment model versus preparing the broader ecosystem. So I think that's where really what we try to do to see how can we make this go better for more people. And I just put some specific things here on the slide that we can see that it's going to be like that rejection, that gridlock from the healthcare system, from the evaluators. And maybe we get access for people who can pay, or just access in a few countries. So it's really going to be, not available to everyone. And one thing that I think we might miss is that if we don't have that infrastructure, this behind the scenes work ready, then there's not going to be investment by drug companies for developing this in Europe. And hopefully with RIPE, with this preparation work that of course also others are doing, we'll have an evidence-based acceptance and that recognition of the value of psychedelic-assisted therapies where they're valuable. And also know what are the reimbursement pathways and get more clarity around it. Again, to also help developers know what they have to do in the trials to eventually lead to reimbursement. And then finally, have that impact on patients. So in the short term, we're planning to map out actually what needs to happen. So from our report, we have the different work streams. Then we want to map out how much will each work stream cost, who needs to be involved, the health economists, the people working on the billing codes, on the evaluation, get them together, but also get together the stakeholders in the psychedelic ecosystem and really get them aligned and say, okay, this is our roadmap to get to access. And then over the next few years, actually help coordinate, help support projects that make this happen. So let's turn reimbursement challenges into clear, actionable pathways. I think and hope that psychedelics are something that can be revolutionary, that can be a new treatment that can help a lot of people. And I hope we'll take some good steps to actually make this happen. You can see the full report on psychedelicsandreimbursement.com. Here's a QR code that also takes you there. Please feel free to email me. And thank you so much for your attention. I hope you've had a great conference and that you're looking forward to the after party. I'll see you next time.